In this video, I'm going to take you through how UA audio interfaces like Apollo and Aero work with Steinberg Cubase on a Windows computer. I'm using an Aero to demonstrate, but the concepts apply to all desktop and rack-mount Apollos as well. Before we begin, be sure you've installed the UAD software and firmware updates and registered your interface at uaudio.com so you're ready to follow along. Apollo and Aero let you hear yourself complete with onboard UAD effects in real time, all the time, with no latency, because it's all done in the interface, not on the host computer. And the keys to this true low-latency recording and monitoring system are onboard UAD processing and the console application. Console runs alongside Cubase and handles all your audio monitoring. It lets you set up your inputs and headphone mixes easily. And you can record yourself through UAD emulations of vintage mic preamps, compressors, EQs, reverbs, or guitar amps with no latency, just like if you were using an analog studio. Console replaces the input monitoring feature in Cubase, so be sure to disable software monitoring in Cubase when using an Aero or Apollo. In Console, all physical and virtual inputs are shown as channel strips, and channel strips are routed directly to the main monitor output, so you hear sound as soon as you plug in an input. You use Console's faders and other controls to create your input mix, but the audio recorded in Cubase is sent at full level before the faders. With universal audio interfaces, onboard DSPs run the mixer and UAD plugins. Interfaces come complete with a basic set of great-sounding plugins right in the box, which include the 610B preamp, the LA2A and 1176 compressors, and the Marshall Plexi Classic guitar amp. You track through them with no latency by adding them to channel strips in the console. You can choose to record with or without effects by toggling the Insert Effects buttons. When set to record, effects will be recorded, and when set to monitor, you'll hear the effects but they won't be recorded. You can set this up channel by channel or all at once using the global Insert Effects buttons on the side panel. When you're ready to mix, you can use the same UAD plugins directly in Cubase. Just be sure to disable anything you're not using in Console to get the most out of your DSP. Unison preamps like the 610B and Marshall are placed in a special insert slot at the top of the channel. They can be used in any channel insert, but when you use the special Unison slot, they take over the physical preamps to complete the hardware model by changing impedance and gain staging. And because of this unique hardware-software interaction, Unison preamps are always recorded, regardless of the state of the Insert Effects switch. The Settings page is where you edit and save hardware and software options. The default settings are a great starting point, but you can customize them at any time, and you may want to set input delay compensation to off for the lowest latency. On Windows, Cubase uses the ASIO driver for communicating with audio interfaces, and Console's unique I/O matrix allows you to customize the driver for your Apollo or Aero. Start by setting it to default. Default lists all of the inputs and outputs on the interface, which you can then reorder to suit your needs. And when you're done, you can store that as a preset. Note that when working at high sample rates, the I/O configuration changes and some channels are disabled. Be sure to refer to the software manual for a complete list of driver tables. There are a few basic ways to set up your headphone mixes. The simplest is to set the cue source to mix. Then everything you hear in the speakers is routed to the built-in headphone outputs, and you control the overall volume with the dedicated knobs on your interface. You can also create discrete headphone mixes, using Console sends for your live audio tracks and Cubase sends for individual DAW tracks. You do this by setting the cue source to HP or Q, and use Console sends and Cubase sends routed to the headphone output to create your headphone mix. Now let's configure Cubase. Launch the app and create a new session so we can set it up for Aero or Apollo. First, we need to load the driver. From the Devices menu, select Device Setup at the bottom of the list. In the Devices column, select VST Audio System. Then, in the ASIO Driver pop-up menu, select the correct driver for your interface from the list. Cubase will ask you if you want to switch the driver, and say Switch. You'll now see your interface called out under VST Audio System on the left side of the page, and when you select it, you'll see the complete list of inputs and outputs listed on the right side of the page. In Cubase, inputs and outputs are configured as buses in the VST Connections window. Click on the Devices menu and select VST Connections, or press F4. We'll configure the inputs first. Open the Inputs tab and recall the preset that matches the I/O count of your interface. It's really helpful to rename the buses so they appear by name throughout the app. And when you're done, save a preset so you don't have to rename them again. In Cubase, the left and right sides of a stereo pair can't be renamed, which can be confusing. So just create duplicate mono buses and name them both so the inputs are shown correctly. Outputs are configured in a similar fashion, so start by clicking on the Outputs tab and recall a preset that matches your output complement. Again, you'll want to rename the buses accordingly and save a preset. Now that the inputs and outputs are configured and named, it's much easier to use them throughout Cubase. With Apollo and Aero, your DAW buffer size doesn't really matter because the hardware handles all real-time audio processing and monitoring without relying on the host computer. The hardware buffer size determines how much latency occurs when looping audio through the application. Cubase uses the interface settings, which are found in the console application. Click on the Control Panel button in the Device Setup menu to open hardware settings directly. If you want to play virtual instruments inside Cubase, set the hardware buffer to a low setting, like 32 or 64 samples. Low buffers use more of the computer's power to minimize latency, and instruments are much easier to play, but of course this reduces the track count. For mixing, you can set the hardware buffer size high so the computer has more horsepower to dedicate to the mixing engine. You'll have to experiment to find the best settings for your computer and workflow, but a good starting point here is 128 samples. Cubase automatically sends the session sample rate to console's internal clock. When you're not using Cubase, you can change the sample rate for other applications. Just use the pop-up menu at the bottom of the mixer window or the hardware settings. When you monitor your audio through Cubase, you'll encounter latency due to buffering, which is usually not a great recording experience. Aero and Apollo let you avoid that input latency altogether by replacing Cubase's software monitor with live audio direct from the interface controlled by the console application. To turn off software monitoring, click on the File menu and select Preferences. Scroll down and select VST in the left column and set it to Manual. This mutes the software input monitor so you only hear the record-enabled track while they're playing back, and then it's muted when you punch in. At all other times, you're hearing your live audio through console. Apollo and Aero have a number of virtual channels, which are connections that let you route audio from applications on your computer to channel strips in the console and vice versa. For example, you can route Cubase's main output to a pair of virtual channels instead of the default main monitor. This makes it easier to blend live sources with DAW playback right in console, using faders. In Cubase, you simply assign your track outputs to the virtual channels you wish to use. You can then link the virtual channels in console to create a stereo fader and then name it for easy identification. In addition to making it easier to mix your live inputs with DAW playback, you get two great headphone mix options for free when you route Cubase's output to virtual channels. First, you can set the cue source to mix and use the main console mix. That's easy. Or you can set the cue source to HP or Q and use channel strip sends to create a separate mix for the headphones. You can use your Aero or Apollo for system sounds like browsers and music applications. To do so, right-click on the speaker icon in the tray and select Playback Device. Just select your audio interface and you're good to go. By default, system sounds are routed directly to Mon left and right, but you can route them to virtual channels on the console. Simply open the I/O matrix and set outputs 1 and 2 to virtual 1 and 2, and then link the channels to create a stereo fader. Now all your audio appears on a channel strip, and you can use UAD plugins to make them sound great. Note that Windows uses two separate audio systems, WDM to handle system sounds and ASIO to handle DAWs. The two systems must use the same sample rate to avoid pops, clicks, and other artifacts. And note that some programs can't share audio resources, so some applications may not work together. You'll find more information and current software at help.uaudio.com. And thanks for watching.